Welcome back to the second part of our lecture on the Progressive Era from around 1900 to after World War II in 1920. Now let's focus on social justice and labor reform issues. This is parallel and complementary to the previous reforms that we discussed in the economic sphere. The focus now is on the working poor, those who aren't working, the jobless, as well as the homeless. And again, the movement was led by educated women, middle class, upper middle class, who were not employed, and they were the ones spearheading this entire movement. One of the major reforms of this era, which was a continuation of efforts in previous decades, was to limit the consumption of alcohol. The feeling was that excessive consumption of alcohol by men was threatening the social progress in all other areas and the stability of families, and led to great amounts of domestic violence, with a significant number of men getting drunk and beating their wives. And unlike now, there was really not much legal recourse to it. Also, men would get into fights in bars and, may not come home alive. Many women were concerned that on payday, the men would go to bars, invite many of their friends for free drinks, and come home with much less money. Particularly working class men didn't make much to begin with, and women felt that that money should be used to support the family and not for the men to have a good night out on the town. The first really significant organization this time period was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. You notice it's Christian, which is consistent with the entire progressive movement here, and it's for temperance. Temperance, as the word suggests, is to temper or limit the consumption of alcohol. So at first they were not talking about total prohibition on the consumption of alcohol, but rather encouraging men to just have one beer or one whiskey instead of an excessive number. Well, this clearly didn't work, and so very quickly they moved to total prohibition on alcohol. This was their symbol for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is one of my favorite photographs. These women are protesting against alcohol with a sign that says, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." And they would go, many women would carry these signs and go parading around in the cities. Women founded what was called the AntiSaloon League. A saloon was like a form of a bar, and they wanted to close them. So rather militant women, these were wealthy, educated women, would often go into bars, saloons. Women were not allowed in, but they'd walk in with axes, and they'd take their axes and destroy the bottles of whiskey and other liquor. And at that time, the saloons or elegant bars had beautiful mirrors behind the bar, and they'd take their axes and break the mirrors and walk out. Many of the men were just sitting or standing there with their mouths open, because these were the wives of leading industrialists or very wealthy men. Some of the women were arrested, but it became a real cause. Now, finally, in 1917, Congress approved Prohibition, which actually did not, we'll look at this later in the course, prohibit the consumption of alcohol. It only prohibited the manufacturing, transportation, or sale of alcohol. And later, shortly thereafter, Congress approved an amendment to the Constitution, which, after it was approved or ratified by 3/4 of the states, became the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And we'll see later in the course, of course, when Prohibition ended in the early 1930s, another amendment was passed to the Constitution to nullify the 18th Amendment. I think it's very important to note that there was actually no need to amend the United States Constitution on this issue. The Constitution, of course, mentioned nothing about alcohol, liquor. The Constitution did not give people the right to consume liquor, did not mention liquor or alcohol in any way, shape, or form. However, people felt so strongly about this issue. The feeling was, well, the Constitution is so important for the United States. And so by enacting an amendment to the Constitution, it will institutionalize prohibition, make it more permanent. But it wasn't needed because the law passed by Congress in 1917, the Volstead Act, had the legal force to do exactly the same thing. And in fact, the constitutional amendment was just window dressing. I might note that in our times, and since this time, many people have advocated amending the Constitution for their favorite cause, even though it does not require an amendment. Because there were Supreme Court cases, many cases, or whatever issues that come to mind are gay marriage, which of course was dealt with by the Supreme Court. People both for and against gay marriage have strongly advocated having constitutional amendments to state their views. Other ones are abortion, obviously a hot button issue on both sides, and there's clearly nothing in the Constitution that needs to be amended. There was a famous Supreme Court decision we'll see later in the course in the 1970s, Roe versus Wade, and there were some others. And people either for or against those Supreme Court decisions want to try and, in effect, make it more permanent by putting it in the Constitution. So this is the first time we've seen really a constitutional amendment that wasn't needed to achieve its goals. Now, previous constitutional amendments we've seen were needed, and some subsequent ones were needed. For instance, the Constitution sets the voting age at 21, and when during the Vietnam War it was decided that the voting age should be reduced to 18 because 18, 19, and 20-year-olds were fighting in Vietnam, some losing their lives, others coming home in wheelchairs or whatever, and they didn't have the right to vote. Well, that did require a constitutional amendment to actually amend or change the Constitution. This is a photo of the time. Obviously, these are federal government agents enforcing the ban on during Prohibition on alcohol and by taking barrels of beer and throwing them down the drain. We'll see more on this when we get to the 1920s. Now, looking at labor, this was really some of the most significant social reform that was implemented, and it was virtually all implemented at the state level by state laws or some cases by city or municipal legislation. In 1900, there were 2 million children aged 10 to 15 working in the cities. Now, there were largely in factories, but they could be in stores or somewhere else. Now, you have to recognize there were many more more children, and no one has a real figure, working on farms. And that's been traditional. The whole family would go out in the harvest, or the children would help with, whatever on the farm. But the progressive era focused on the cities, the urban areas, the medium-sized and large-sized cities. Now, by 1910, most states, not the federal government, had implemented laws against child labor. And the states limited hours for both children and women. The belief was for women that too many hours would exhaust the women. They were called the, quote, weaker sex in physical terms, and therefore the feeling was their hours had to be limited many years before they actually limited the working hours for men. In 1911, New York City had a tragic fire in the Triangle Shirt Factory. I'm sorry, factory is misspelled. The factory. And that was a sweatshop. A sweatshop is, as the name suggests, where a lot of people are crammed together, working hard, and, sweating. Well, 146 people died. They were virtually all teenage girls, young immigrants. And the reason they couldn't escape is the owner had locked the doors because he feared that the workers would sneak out with clothes, steal. So, all the fire, what we call today fire escapes, were locked, and so they could search the women when they left. Well, this outraged virtually everybody, and so it led to a multitude of both city and state laws dealing with fire safety, and then that was expanded to working conditions and also child labor. This is a photograph after the Triangle fire, and the banner on the left says, Ladies Waist and Dressmakers Union, Local 25, we mourn our loss. And the one on the right says, we mourn our loss, United Hebrew Trades of New York. And it's interesting, you can see in the upper left-hand corner the name of a store, in English at the bottom, and then larger in Hebrew, because New York City at this time had many, many ethnic neighborhoods. It still has some, but many more at that time. Now, a major reform at this time was so-called progressive income tax. Progressive has a very technical meaning in economics, and that's what it means here. Yes, it was passed during the progressive era, so that makes it kind of modern, etc. But a progressive income tax is one in which the rate of taxation increases with income. For instance, and I'm just making these numbers up, let's assume your income is $50,000 a year. Your federal income tax rate might be 15%. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but 15%, which means for every additional dollar you earn, you pay 15 cents in additional income tax. But then under a progressive income tax system, so the person who makes $50,000 a year is paying for each additional dollar 15% or 15 cents. But let's say your income is $200,000 a year. The tax rate is, I think it's 35%, which means you earn an additional dollar, you pay 35 cents rather, of that additional dollar. It's progressive, and the theory is if you don't make much money, you, the worker or employee, need to keep more of that money for housing, food, clothing, etc., etc., where people at higher income levels don't need so much additional money for the necessities of life. And actually, in the 1960s, the highest income tax in the United States on wealthy people was up in this, I think, 70 or 80%. It's lower now, but so that's called progressive income tax. The idea was to redistribute wealth through the tax rates and also lower the tariffs on imports. Now, in 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted, and that provided for an income tax. There was no federal income tax before 1913. I can hear some of you going, yay! Well, there wasn't. Where did the federal government get its money? Well, it needed a lot less money relative to today because the federal government was much smaller in many, many ways. it got its money through two ways. One was through tariffs, which are taxes on imports. So the tariff was very, very important. And we looked at it, well, in the earlier course, a lot on political aspects, but it was a great source of revenue. And the federal government earned money by selling land because the federal government essentially owned the West, everything that it acquired, and it sold that land. But they had sort of run out of land to sell by 1913. The government was increasing in size and scope, and it needed more money. Now, the top rate when it was established was only 7% for the wealthiest, which meant 99% of Americans, virtually all, paid no income tax, paid no tax because their income was too low. So the threshold was pretty high. Today, I don't remember what the threshold is. I should have a tax table in front of me right now. But I believe if you make, if you're single, if you make $15,000 or $20,000 a year, you don't pay any federal income tax. And I think if you have a spouse and a couple kids, it goes up to $30,000 or $40,000 a year. The idea is you don't have a lot of money to spare. Now, the next point, sales tax is not progressive. It's not progressive in the economic sense. Forget what progressive means in today's politics or what it meant in the progressive era. It's not progressive because if you go out and buy a cheap used car for $500, it might not even run for that, let's say $1,000, you pay exactly the same sales tax as someone who goes out and buys a top-of-the-line Mercedes-Benz or Tesla. And I think in the Houston area, that's 8 or 8.25% sales tax. So you pay the same. So it's not progressive. You go to the grocery store, there's no sales tax on unprocessed food like meat or vegetables and things, things like that. But if you buy a box of cereal that is processed, then you will pay sales tax on that. So if you're rather poor, you're paying the same sales tax on that box of cereal, which may be your dinner, as the wealthy person who's buying it. So it's not progressive. Again, this has a very specific economic meaning. The opposite of it is regressive in economic terms. So you may well have learned this in economics class. I hope you did. Something like the sales tax is regressive because it's the same rate no matter what you pay, no matter what your income is. And now the estate tax we have today, it kicks in at a fairly high level. Most of us aren't concerned about it, but if you've built up a business or you have a lot of money and you leave your money in an inheritance to someone, they pay very high federal income tax, and most states have a estate tax. The idea being to redistribute wealth. This is a very hot political issue, but that is considered progressive in economic terms. Okay, let's move on to health and medicine, and particularly food and medicine in the health area. Now, the muckraking journalists, as we saw before, exposed abuses. And one of the best examples is Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. There's an excerpt of this in one of the e-reader articles. Be sure you read it, and be sure you know for the exam who Upton Sinclair is and the name of his book. It's a novel. It's a story of an immigrant family in Chicago, Illinois, where the man, Jurgis, works in a meatpacking plant. Now, Upton Sinclair wrote this novel not to expose the terrible meat that people were eating, but rather the poor lives of the immigrants, how the immigrants had a really tough life with capitalism, and he wrote it hoping that people would read it and give workers more rights. And in fact, he was a socialist personally, and so He didn't write it to expose the dirty meat people were eating. However, everybody read the book, and I think you'll have the same reaction after you read the excerpt of, like 5 pages in the e-reader article. People were saying, "Oh my God, that's what's in the meat," because you get the meat from the butcher shop then, and it looks fine. And Upton Sinclair talked about how they put rat poison around the meat packing plant, where what they did, the meat packing plant, is the cows would come in on refrigerated rail cars, and they'd cut up the cows and mix the meat and make hamburger meat, or cut the slices and sell it, and then ship it out on refrigerated rail cars. Well, for like making hamburgers or sausages, he said workers would pick up the dead rats, the rats were dead because they'd eaten poison, and just throw them into the big mixers. So could you imagine being home eating a hamburger and reading this, and people were just disgusted. Or the sausages. Many, many, many Americans ate sausage for breakfast then. The standard breakfast at this time was eggs and meat and potatoes or something. It wasn't a bowl of cereal or a yogurt or a bagel, something like that. And it's said that President Theodore Roosevelt was president when this book came out, and he started reading it over breakfast, and he was physically sick and became a proponent. So people read this, they couldn't believe the unsanitary conditions, and so it led to Congress passing the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which required federal government to inspect all meat plants and all meat sold. This is still in effect, and to ensure the safety for people, because you have no idea what's in your hamburger meat. It led also to the broader Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which covers more than meat, and it also covers pharmaceutical, what today we call pharmaceuticals or drugs. And this, of course, is administered by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. And what they do nowadays is, obviously, the FDA looks at the safety of drugs, as well as the efficacy, if they're really efficient. Because until this time, people were selling all kinds of elixirs, they call them, and they were bottles, and it was going to cure this same bottle. You take a cup of it, it was going to cure everything from acne to dandruff to body odor to you name it. And so what people would do was they would drink it not knowing it was like 70 or 80% liquor, with flavoring in it. And that made them feel better. And many of them had narcotic drugs in them. Many of them had derivatives of cocaine or some other opiate in them. And so people felt better. They thought, "Oh, this is good." But it really had no medical value. And of course, some people were dying from those ingredients. This is just the first edition of The Jungle, showing the cover. This is one of the meat plants in Chicago at the time, and the carcass of the animal would come down. And it's an assembly line. And Henry Ford modeled his assembly line for cars on these meat packing plants, because the carcass, and each man would cut off a bit of it or do something. This is President Roosevelt. This is the cartoon at the time. It says, "A nauseating job, but it must be done." And what you have is he's holding a rake. Remember the phrase muckraker? And the rake says investigation. And down below it says meat scandal. And in the small print down below, if you can't read it, it says, "President Roosevelt takes hold of the investigating muckrake himself in the packing house scandal." So here's our activist President Roosevelt himself. Obviously, he's not going out with a physical rake and doing this, but he's a powerful president. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture was empowered by Congress to inspect meat. And this is still done today. And they would go into a meat packing plant, and they'd look at the meat. And you can see in the back it says U.S. condemned. If they found These are people who, if they found something in the meat that was diseased or whatever, they would not allow it to be sold. And these were the early stamps that they'd put on condemned meat. Next time you're in the supermarket, please go to the meat section where they'll sell, and particularly you'll see it with steaks. Take a look at the steaks, and they all have, it says USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it has the grade of the meat. The most expensive steak is the meat with the most fat, the white fat. It's called marbling. And why is that the most effective? Because anyone who's barbecued a steak knows the more fat in the steak, when you put it on, it becomes juicier and it's considered more delicious. Obviously, it's not as healthy for you with all the fat, but it certainly is delicious, in my view. But you'll see they have ratings, and it's like USDA Prime, Choice, I forget what the others are. And so the Department of Agriculture has set up standards. You just can't say this is a prime steak. It has to meet the standard for a certain, percentage of fat. But this is taken very, very seriously. Now, is this relevant today? Well, of course it is. We just talked about the steaks. But what happened recently here in Texas? Bluebell ice cream, which is sort of iconic of Texas. I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, the federal government closed their plants because several people died from their ice cream. It had a bacteria called Listeria, which survives when it's frozen. And the Bluebell factory, including the one in Brenham, it has others, was not properly cleaned and maintained. And so Listeria got into the ice cream, and it particularly got into ice cream that was sold to some nursing homes, and the elderly people ate the Listeria bacteria, and I think 3 or 5 died, and many other people were sick. So Bluebell was closed, and it was my favorite ice cream at the time. I was quite upset, but that was the role of the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. Then they sent. Someone bought Bluebell ice cream, an investor. It almost went bankrupt. It did go bankrupt. And then, now the FDA has more routine inspections of Bluebell factories. But the same thing, the FDA approves medicine. It's a big political issue nowadays because it takes so long to approve a new medication, because they have to do all kinds of trials to make sure it's safe, and then to make sure it actually does what it's supposed to do. Next time you get a prescription medication, it comes with a little pamphlet inside that we all toss in the trash. Well, open that up and it will show the trials. They give what's called a placebo, or like a pill with sugar in it, to some patients. Others get the medicine. Neither the patient nor the doctor knows which pill the person's getting. And they do studies to see if it actually does what it's supposed to do. And they also, of course, look at the side effects. So that's a very important process. And of course, every government does this. Every government around the world now does this. Just finally, environmental conservation. I mentioned earlier, Theodore Roosevelt was a real naturalist. He'd been a rancher. He loved nature. He was from a very wealthy family, so he had a lot of time when he didn't have to work, and he just traveled around and observed nature, including going to South America. Now, he strongly opposed logging and mining without regulations, and started having the federal government regulate logging and mining to make it more sustainable. He also got Congress to approve the national park system, which of course we still have. Many wildlife refuges, bird sanctuaries, and national monuments, including the Grand Canyon. Theodore Roosevelt had visited the Grand Canyon. He drafted down part of it. And, he was very dynamic, and he got Congress to set up the national park system. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning in the first part, the Progressives was a white movement, and it was really concerned about the welfare of whites. And it really, today's term, we'd say it was very, very racist. The people, as they viewed it, did not include blacks, Indians, and some immigrant groups, particularly Catholics, because Catholics, as we've seen before, were considered papists, whose primary loyalty was to the Pope in Vatican City and not the United States. And finally, what is the legacy of the progressive era? Well, it's a huge legacy. On the political side, great increase in direct democracy, or more direct democracy in our Republican form of government, which is based, of course, on Republican Rome. We have direct election of U.S. senators starting in 1913. We have initiative recall. We have much cleaner democracy. We have primaries to determine candidates for the political parties. A major expansion of federal, state, and local power. And sort of one of the themes I see of American history is, from the Constitution was, of course, written at a time when so-called founding fathers wanted to limit the power of a new central government. They'd, of course, first set up the Articles of Confederation, which had virtually no power or authority of the federal government. And then it turned out that that wasn't working, it wasn't practical, and they set up the Constitution. And essentially to limit to the absolute minimum the power of the national government. And of course, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which you studied, I think, in the earlier history course, specifically gives to the states and the people any powers not expressly given to the federal government. And the Bill of Rights is a series of limits on the federal government. But since then, there's been a steady increase, for better or worse, depending on your own viewpoint, in the power of particularly the federal government, also state and local governments. And what we see in the progressive area is a significant expansion of power at all three levels. And we'll see significantly more power go to the federal government when we get to the 1930s and the Depression. And so what it did is it ended the traditional laissez-faire idea that government had no role whatsoever in protecting the public welfare. That should be left to churches or philanthropic groups of wealthy people. And the laissez-faire idea that the government should not regulate the economy. It should be totally laissez-faire. Okay, well, thank you very much. And in the next class, we'll look at the origins and U.S. involvement in the First World War.